February 2026. Cuba is running on borrowed time. Official estimates confirm the island has between 15 and 20 days of crude oil remaining at current consumption rates. After that, power generation drops below survivable thresholds, not rolling blackouts. System failure. Electricity is not a convenience in Cuba. It is the backbone of water pumping, hospital equipment, food preservation, transportation, and basic state control. When the oil stops, everything else follows. Washington knows this. That's why new tariffs are announced, not against Cuba directly, but against any country that sells oil to Cuba. Secondary sanctions. Economic warfare by proxy. Moscow issues statements condemning the pressure. Beijing calls it a violation of sovereignty. Mexico promises humanitarian aid while quietly suspending commercial shipments. Diplomacy fills the headlines. In Havana, reality fills the streets. Blackouts stretch past 20 hours at a time. Elevators stop mid-rise. Refrigeration fails. Hospitals ration electricity by ward. Food prices jump weekly, then daily, then hourly. This is not 1962, when superpowers negotiated Cuba's fate behind closed doors. This is 2026, where an island 90 miles from Florida becomes the test case for whether economic strangulation can succeed where invasion failed. The question is no longer whether Cuba is in crisis. The question is whether anyone is willing to pay the real cost to stop the clock, and what happens when it reaches zero. To understand why Cuba is collapsing now, you have to look south, not north. January 3, 2026, Caracas. In the early hours of the morning, U.S. Special Forces raid Nicolas Maduro's compound. Explosions light up northern Venezuela. Air defenses are neutralized. By sunrise, Maduro is in American custody. Photographed, blindfolded, bound, transferred for prosecution, the headlines focus on regime change. But the real casualty isn't political, it's logistical. Among those killed in the operation are dozens of Cuban personnel. Because Cuba didn't just support Venezuela ideologically, it ran it operationally. Cuban intelligence embedded inside Venezuela's security services, military command, and presidential protection units. In exchange, Venezuela supplied Cuba with oil. Cheap oil. Subsidized oil. Roughly 46,000 barrels per day. That flow powered Cuban electricity, transportation, and hard currency revenue for decades. When Maduro was captured, that pipeline didn't slow. It died instantly. Within weeks, Mexico's secondary shipments halted under U.S. pressure. 17,000 barrels per day erased. Do the math. Cuba needs roughly 60,000 barrels daily to maintain basic grid stability. There is no reserve margin, no backup supplier, no emergency plan. The oil deal with Venezuela wasn't just an energy arrangement, it was the economic architecture holding Cuba together after the Soviet collapse. And when that architecture failed, it exposed how little had been rebuilt underneath it. For 25 years, Venezuelan oil didn't just keep Cuba running. It allowed Cuba to avoid reform. Cheap crude meant electricity without efficiency, transportation without maintenance, and an economy that never had to stand on its own. While the oil flowed, structural decay stayed hidden. Domestic production collapsed quietly. Sugar harvests that once measured in millions of tons fell to historic lows. Manufacturing lines rusted. Infrastructure aged without replacement. Real wages shrank year after year, but the lights stayed on, so the system survived. Dependency rewires incentives. When your economy runs on someone else's oil, diversification feels unnecessary. Reform feels dangerous. You assume the supply continues because it always has. And when it stops, you don't just lose fuel, you lose time. Cuba's leadership knew Venezuela was unstable, but they bet that any transition would preserve the oil relationship. That assumption was wrong. When the pipeline went dry, Cuba lost power generation, lost hard currency from reselling subsidized crude, and lost the financial cushion used to import food and medicine. The collapse wasn't gradual, it was synchronized. Energy shortages triggered water shortages. Water shortages triggered sanitation failures. Sanitation failures triggered disease outbreaks. Transportation breakdowns isolated workers from jobs that barely paid enough to survive anyway. Farmers reverted from tractors to oxen. Then oxen disappeared, stolen for meat. This is what systemic dependency looks like when the external support vanishes. Not a crisis in one sector, a cascading failure across all of them at once. Washington didn't cause Cuba's dependence, but it understood how to exploit it. Executive orders didn't target Havana directly. They targeted everyone around it. Any country selling oil to Cuba faced escalating tariffs, not symbolic ones. Tariffs large enough to wipe out export profits overnight. This transformed oil into a liability. Mexico felt it immediately. Proximity made Mexico Cuba's only realistic near-term supplier. Capacity made it indispensable. But trade exposure made it vulnerable. U.S. lawmakers signaled that continued shipments would trigger penalties under broader trade negotiations. Mexico paused commercial deliveries while maintaining humanitarian aid, a legal distinction that changes nothing on the grid. International votes condemned the embargo overwhelmingly. 165 nations opposed it. 7 supported it. The votes changed nothing. Secondary sanctions don't require consensus. They require leverage. Russia denounced the pressure and pledged support. China condemned unilateral coercive measures. Statements filled press releases. Oil tankers did not fill harbors. Economic warfare doesn't rely on isolation. It relies on fear. Fear of losing access to larger markets, fear of retaliation, fear of escalation. And as the world debated legality, Cuba's reserves kept draining. Satellites tracked empty routes, ports stayed quiet. The countdown continued, measured not in speeches, but in megawatts lost per hour. As the reserves fell, foreign support became the last variable standing between Cuba and total grid failure. Moscow moved first, at least symbolically. Russian officials condemned the pressure campaign and framed it as economic aggression. A tanker arrived carrying crude. The shipment bought time. Roughly 2 to 3 weeks of consumption at emergency levels, enough to delay collapse, not enough to reverse it. The trend told the real story. Russian deliveries had been shrinking every year, not expanding. War commitments, sanctions, and limited capacity meant Moscow could signal presence but not sustain an island economy 90 miles from U.S. shores. Beijing's response was quieter. Diplomatic condemnation, infrastructure talks, statements about sovereignty and multipolar order, but no confirmed oil shipments, no tankers rerouted. China's calculus was simple. Rhetoric costs nothing. Oil deliveries risk retaliation across trade lanes that actually matter. Great power solidarity has limits when the bill comes due. Mexico remained the pivot point. Close enough to supply, large enough to matter, exposed enough to be pressured. Commercial shipments stayed suspended. Humanitarian aid flowed through naval channels. Food and goods arrived. Fuel did not. Every promise extended Cuba's survival by days, not months. Each delay reduced the chance of stabilization. External support became triage, not treatment. Enough to prevent immediate collapse, never enough to restore equilibrium. The system didn't fail all at once. It entered a permanent emergency state, where survival replaced recovery as the objective. The numbers told one story. Daily life told another. Blackouts stretched beyond a full day in many provinces. Thermoelectric plants shut down one by one as maintenance stopped and spare parts ran out. Electricity deficits crossed 70% during peak hours. Without power, water pumping failed. Entire neighborhoods lost access. Refrigeration stopped. Food spoiled faster than wages could replace it. Hospitals operated on rationed electricity, prioritizing critical wards while turning patients away without treatment. Medicines disappeared. Diagnostic equipment went dark. Diseases spread that should have been contained. Prices detached from salaries completely. A week of groceries cost more than a month's income. Transportation collapsed. Commutes stretched from minutes to hours. Fuel lines turned into waiting lists measured in weeks. The peso lost value faster than official statistics could track it. Informal exchange rates told the truth. What remained of public patience eroded quietly. Not through mass protests, through exhaustion, through adaptation, through people lowering expectations one step at a time. This is how collapse looks when it doesn't explode. It grinds. It narrows choices until survival consumes every decision. And while foreign capitals debated strategy, ordinary Cubans counted hours of light, liters of water, and days until nothing worked at all. As conditions deteriorated, attention shifted from shortages to stability. The Cuban government's messaging remained defiant. Official statements framed the crisis as external aggression, not internal failure. Slogans returned. Resistance rhetoric intensified. Military readiness exercises were announced. The language of siege replaced the language of reform. But capability told a different story. Cuba's armed forces were smaller than during past crises. Training cycles had been reduced. Equipment maintenance suffered from the same shortages affecting civilians. The internal security apparatus remained intact, but its effectiveness depended on resources that were also running out. Elite cohesion became the central unknown. Systems built on control work as long as loyalty can be provisioned. When supplies tighten, fractures appear. Some factions favored negotiation, others pushed resistance at any cost. None had a clear path to recovery without external fuel. Political prisoners from earlier protests remained jailed, signaling that repression capacity still existed. But repression doesn't generate electricity. It doesn't transport food. It doesn't stabilize currencies. The leadership faced a narrowing set of choices: concede under pressure, endure and hope for external rescue, or manage collapse without surrender. History offered no clean precedent. The regime had survived invasions, embargoes, and isolation. It had never faced energy failure at this scale without a patron. The question wasn't whether the government wanted to survive. It was whether the system could hold together long enough to find a way out. By mid-February, analysts outlined 5 possible outcomes. The first was managed endurance. Limited foreign shipments continue. Blackouts become routine. Scarcity becomes permanent. Control holds. Life degrades, but collapse stalls. The second was internal fracture. Oil reaches zero. Services fail completely. Elite unity breaks. A military or party intervention forces change from within. The third was negotiated transition. Economic pressure pushes leadership toward talks in exchange for sanctions relief. A face-saving exit. The fourth was external escalation. A naval blockade or expanded enforcement cuts off all shipments. Humanitarian catastrophe accelerates. Great power confrontation becomes unavoidable. The fifth was unexpected stabilization. Russia or China dramatically increase support. Venezuela's post-Maduro government restores limited flows. Washington accepts a compromise. This path required multiple actors to reverse course simultaneously. The least likely scenario. Each outcome shared one constant: time. The countdown governed them all. 15 to 20 days of oil had become the clock by which every decision was measured. Policy debates compressed into survival math. Every tanker mattered. Every delay mattered. Every promise was weighed against reality. Cuba's crisis doesn't end with a single moment of darkness. It settles into something worse. A prolonged state where nothing fully works and nothing fully collapses. History calls this the special period. Cubans call it survival. External support, when it arrives, buys days, not recovery. Symbolic shipments prevent total failure while locking the country into permanent scarcity. Great powers issue statements calibrated to avoid confrontation. No one wants escalation 90 miles from Florida. No one wants responsibility for 11 million people either. Economic models built on external lifelines fail the same way every time. When the patron disappears, the system exposed underneath has nothing to stand on. Venezuela proved this first. Cuba is proving it again, faster. Washington believes pressure will force change. Havana believes endurance will outlast pressure. Russia and China believe time weakens American resolve. Each side assumes the other blinks first. Meanwhile, ordinary Cubans adapt downward. Blackouts normalize, water becomes scheduled, food becomes improvised, hope becomes conditional. This is what economic warfare looks like after the speeches end. Not victory, not collapse, attrition. The clock that began with oil doesn't stop when the reserves hit zero. It just changes what's being counted. Days without power, weeks without medicine, months without recovery. Whether the regime survives, reforms, or fractures remains unresolved. But one conclusion is already clear. Energy was never just fuel, it was the quiet foundation holding everything else together. When it vanished, it revealed how thin the margin really was. It's February 2026. Cuba has days of oil left. The countdown isn't theoretical anymore. It's happening in real time. If you watch this far, you already understand why this story matters. Stay with it. The next chapter won't be announced by press conferences. It will be visible in the lights.